Oh, hello my friends, hope you are well. It's been a while since I've done a kind of sci-fi diorama, but I've been really feeling the urge recently. So today I thought I'd whip up another little underground bunker scene, kind of like the survivalist one I did, but going for a bit more of an armory vibe this time. Let's get into it.
Swamp Rip.
Now I'm starting off with a bit of a bodged up plate for this build. It's pretty much the same as my normal ones, just having this extra panel coming higher up the back to act as the foundation for adding my wall details. The floor is the first thing I'll be adding, as it'd be quite difficult to do this after I've built everything else up. And I'm going for a bit of a tried and tested material here, using this diamond pattern plasticard sheet, as I've done in some of my previous videos. The idea for this build was to have a kind of cross section of an underground Cadian armoury, and I thought it'd be fun to construct a protected booth where the more serious firepower would be locked away, and have a little quartermaster guy here dishing it out. In the survivalist diorama I did a while ago, I found that using balsa wood covered with a layer of plasticard was a great way to build up bulky details. The balsa wood is really soft and easy to cut and shape, which makes it really useful for the basic structural pieces, while the plasticard allows you to cover up that wood grain texture and get the hard angular edges we want when building sci-fi stuff. So after using that method for this little desk area, I had a bit of trim around the bottom edge for some extra pizzazz, and then got to work filling in some of the details behind it. The first thing I did was add some of this squared plasticard sheet, as I thought the texture would look good as a mounting board for some weaponry, and adding this little triangle piece into this gap was probably the most satisfying thing I've done all year. Next, I chucked in this random crate thing I had left over from who knows what, did a bit more trim across the top using some cornered plasticard rod stuff, and then stuck on a bunch of little greebly details I'd scavenged from my bit box, including some of that larger firepower that needs to be kept under lock and key. And that was looking pretty good for the moment, so let's move on to the next section. I wasn't sure what to put in this area at first, but after building up the little serving booth, I thought it'd be a fun idea to add a kind of self-service section as well. So this is for all the awkward Cadians like myself that don't want to make small talk with the cashiers and who would rather just go to the self-checkout and have to fight against unexpected items in the baggage area instead. My plan for this was to have a kind of conveyor belt system poking out of the wall, implying there's a whole warehouse full of ammunition and weaponry on the other side. So after I'd made the basic housing shape, I got to work on building up the actual conveyor belt itself. For this, I'd sandwiched some little tubular offcuts of plasticard between some corner pieces, giving me this row of slightly wonky rollers. That wonkiness wasn't a massive issue though, as I bent and glued on this thinner piece of plasticard to act as the belt, and I was planning to leave it like this, but it looked a little bit too plain and boring, so I glued on some of these sandwich bag wire tie things, which worked really well and gave it a much more interesting texture. It's just a shame that my wife's sandwiches are going to be flying out of their bags like rabid geese from now on. I glued the newly assembled belt into place, then attached these plasticard rods I'd filed down to match its rounded profile. These helped to give the belt a bit more of a reinforced and structurally sound appearance, and once they were in, I put in some more work to flesh out the machinery housing, using a variety of different plasticard rods and sheets. Once that was looking a bit more bulked out, I glued on some little leftover Cadian greebly pieces and then added a variety of different plasticard pipes and rods into the corner here to give that some detail as well. I had this spare computer screen from a field ordnance battery kit, and I thought it'd work well as a self-service screen for ordering supplies through, so I glued this down onto another large miscellaneous sci-fi crate here, which allowed me to attach a screen at a reasonable height for the miniatures. And I was actually really pumped about this area, to be fair. One of my favourite things about sci-fi dioramas is that I'm always forced to come up with different sub-builds for making machinery and other details, so it felt really satisfying to have made this conveyor belt thing from scratch using plasticard, so yeah, good times. Now that I've got the main larger structures added, I got to work on finishing the rest of the building stuff off, and I made a start by creating a frame around the weaponry booth. My plan was to enclose this booth in some fake bulletproof glass, so I needed this frame to glue my sheets of plastic onto later. The process for this was quite simple. I just drilled out a hole in each corner where the post would go, then carefully measured and cut out some plasticard rods to line up with the top piece of trim I had added above the door earlier. I stuck each rod into their respective holes using a squirt of glue to help secure them, and once they were in place I added a top section of squared plasticard rods to hold everything in shape. This came out ever so slightly wonky because that's the level of finish my skills allow, but it was still pretty cool, and it shouldn't be very noticeable once everything else is added too. There were some areas on the walls which are still blank at this point, and I didn't have anything really exciting I wanted to add there, so I just decided to break them up and create some texture by gluing in some offcuts of plasticard. This instantly looked a lot better without a great deal of effort, but I thought adding some rivets here too would help to push the visual interest even further. So after penciling their rough positions, I got to work painstakingly gluing these tiny little buggers into place. You can buy actual specially made rivets for miniatures and dioramas, but I've just been making them by chopping these really thin plasticard rods into tiny little discs, and that seems to work pretty well, so don't waste your money. After finishing the rivets off, I drilled out some holes around the self-service checkout area and used a few guitar strings to add wires connecting all the little contraptions over here. I then went around and added some last details wherever it was looking a little bit empty, and for the conveyor belt area I wanted to make it look like maybe it was malfunctioning and spewing out items, so I added a little bit of clutter down below it. Then finished everything off with whatever this thing is and a lovely little grate down here on the bottom of the service booth. And there we have it, my friends. That's all the building work on the main static components done now, meaning it's probably time I got to work on the miniatures. I wanted to have 3 miniatures in this scene, with 2 interacting around the service booth and 1 using the self-service area. So I made a start with the armourer himself, being the guy who'll stand in the little booth and hand out weaponry. This guy got a little field cap instead of a helmet since he's not going to be in a combat role, and I wanted him to be handing this grenade launcher over the counter, so I had to make a couple of slight adaptations, including removing the hands from its grip and then chopping away a portion of its body so it'd sit nicely onto these hands holding some kind of bandage or map or maybe toilet roll. There was still a small amount of this toilet roll map bandage left when I attached everything, but I didn't think it would be visible once the miniature was painted and glued on, so I just left it in and moved on to the next Cadian boy. The second one to be built was the guy I wanted to stand in front of the counter waiting to receive the grenade launcher, and I gave him this arm holding a helmet, which I later realised was on the wrong side, but I didn't really care because it gave him a nice, cool and casual off-duty look. Then I added this other arm because I love the pose of the hand. It was as if this guy was looking at the grenade launcher and pinching his fingers together saying, "Can I have something just a little bit bigger?" And he just got finished off using a head with some slick back hair and a backpack to carry around all his baked beans. For our final soldier, I gave him this arm with a pointing hand that could be lined up to work quite well with the little computer screen, and then the only real adjustment I made to him was to cut off and reposition the hand on his left, so he could be kind of resting his lasgun at his side as he taps away on the screen. I was quite happy with how these miniatures were posed now. I think each pose adds to the dynamic effect of the scene, making it look like there's something going on here instead of just some static army guys standing in place. But I wasn't really happy with the big empty space on the floor here. In hindsight, I should have just made the diorama a bit more narrow so this didn't exist, but since I didn't do that, I needed to fill it up with something. I didn't want to add anything too big here that would obscure the miniatures, so I decided to make a little handcart with a heavy weapon chained up on top of it to chuck in one corner, and this pile of miscellaneous Cadian combat gear to go into the other. I positioned them on the side shown here at first, but I decided not to glue them down for now, which ended up being a really good call as later on I switched the sides over, and it helped to open the scene up a lot more. So yeah, now the building work was done, our miniatures were posed, and the horrible empty spots on the floor were filled up with scatter, meaning it was time to start painting. I made a start on the Cadens first, as I always enjoy painting these guys up, and I wasn't doing anything spectacular with them really. I just wanted to go for the kind of typical box art colour scheme for that classic look. So after hitting the fatigues and the armoured pieces, I touched up the miscellaneous details like the boot guard things that I can never remember the name of, comment down below if you know what they're called, and then all the metallic details too. They each got a wash of Agrax Earthshade for the fatigues, a Thonian camo shade for the armour, and Nulnor for all the metallic details. Then I just went around and started adding all the little highlights which helped to start bringing the miniatures to life. This stage can be a bit tedious sometimes, but the more effort you put in here, the better your miniatures will look in the end, so definitely sink some time in here if you can. Next, the skin got a 3-step treatment of Bugman's Glow, Cadian flesh tone, surprise surprise, and a final highlight with some Kislev flesh. Then I just dotted in the eyes and finished off the last details like the aquillas and whatever else I'd inevitably missed at this point, and with that, our boys are ready to go. So they're looking pretty good overall. There are a few areas I wasn't massively concerned about getting perfect since they won't really be visible, but yeah, generally speaking I think these look quite nice. I do love Cadians, they're probably my favourite of all the 40k factions, which is part of the reason they end up being used in so many of the sci-fi builds I do. They're just a really cool bridge between modern, realistic combat soldiers and the more wacky sci-fi style troops we see in tabletop games. But anyway, on to the diorama. The diorama itself also got another pretty simple paint job, which is what I like usually. I just started off by overbrushing a dark metallic colour on the floor and a bunch of other areas like the riveted wall panels, this door, and some of the bulky pieces of the self-service area. I also painted in this golden AK like I did in the survivalist diorama, just because I like the cheesy little extra touch it adds. Next, I went around with a pale grey colour and used this to paint in the desk area around the weaponry booth, the majority of the conveyor belt housing, and then also some of these bulky self-service bits I painted metallic, as I thought the grey would help to break everything up a bit more. I did have to do a few coats of this, especially around the weaponry booth, as it was pretty hard to build up a nice even coat on the large flat surfaces using a brush. Who would have thought? I then gave a base coat to all the remaining little details scattered around the place, and also painted a cheeky little hazard stripe on the flap above the conveyor belt, because every single sci-fi or 40k scene I paint needs to have one of these somewhere. It's basically a legal requirement at this point. Now that everything's had a coat or two of paint, it's looking pretty good, but it would definitely benefit from some depth and a bit of a grimdark injection. So I'm going to cover the whole thing using this AK streaking grime. I sloshed this on all over the place, making sure everything's had a nice covering, and then just before it dries fully, I come in with some white spirit on a cotton bud to start removing the excess, leaving behind a nice dirty patina on all the surfaces that have been blessed by its presence. And that looks way better once it's done, but now it is kind of dark. It's a bit too dark and monotone now, so I use some little scraps of sponge and a brush to go around stippling on some of those original colours, with the stippling allowing me to build up a bit more of a random and irregular pattern of colour. This, combined with the streak and grime, helps to make things look like they've aged and been dirtied up organically, as opposed to just having been done by some sweaty rat from a swamp. I use a brush to add some little scratchy bits on the metallics and pick out some of the finer details on the smaller items we added. Then I crack out the dirty down rust to add some nice streaking rust spots around the rivets and the hard edges of some of the scenery. Usually I just slather this stuff on all over like I did the streaking grime, but for this build I got a much better effect by using it sparingly and layering it up to accentuate those areas the streaking grime hit the most. So sometimes less is definitely more. The last few details I paint in are the computer screen and the light over this door, and then I painted up the scatter pieces I'd made earlier, using similar colours to blend them in with all the other bits we've painted so far. The handcart especially got a good helping of rust to make it look quite old and worn out, and it was at this point I tried adding them on the opposite sides I had originally planned to, which had a way better effect on the diorama overall and made me glad I hadn't glued them down earlier. To get this diorama completely finished off, it was now time to add the kind of mock bulletproof glass casing around the booth, and for this I just measured and cut out some little offcuts of this leftover plastic packaging. For the front piece I cut out a large square and boxed in the sides using some corner pieces of plastic cards to give it a more reinforced look. And this hole is obviously way too big to be practical in a real protected armory, but I had to do it for the benefit of the diorama. I made sure to glue the counterman in place before I started attaching the glass, and once I had added all of that, I used a few more pieces of plasticard rod I'd painted up to box in all the rough edges of the glass booth and make it look a bit more reinforced. With that, we were officially done with this build, so let's see how it came out. So, my friends, what do you think? Pretty good or nah? I really enjoyed making this diorama, and as I mentioned earlier, part of that is because these sci-fi builds really forced me to experiment and branch out into new building techniques in order to create pieces of scenery or details that would actually fit into the world they're from. So I was really proud of the little conveyor belt machinery thingamajig I built, and also quite proud of the weaponry booth with the pseudo bulletproof glass casing. Making these was really fun and has given me a bunch of ideas for future builds. Also, one slightly random thing I did find a lot of value in this time was having this detachable scatter on the diorama. This was great because the positions I had planned to glue them in the first place would have made everything feel quite hemmed in, so leaving them detachable meant I found a much better composition for the diorama in the end. But it's also got me thinking about the possibilities for changeable components in dioramas like we have for larger scenery and terrain pieces used in tabletop gaming. Is there a potential for modular diorama pieces? Who knows? Maybe or maybe not, but I'm open to playing around with this idea in the future. So if you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment. Let me know down below if you think there is a potential for modular diorama pieces, or if you think I'm just a sweaty nerd who's chatting out his ass. But either way, as always, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.